May I go back down?
I think so. It's now. Okay. Thanks for coming to the session, Disability Technology and the Digital Divide, and for bearing with us while we get set up. I find the accessibility panels are really always the most creative. So here we go. First up, we've got Floyd Morris from the University of West Indies Centre for Disability Studies, and he'll be speaking about media, disability and development in the Anglophone Caribbean. So thank you, Floyd.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. And I'm very happy to be here at this very special presentation. And via introduction, my very good friend and distinguished professor from the University of the West Indies, Professor Hopton Dunn, did a brief intro of me this morning. And just to indicate that I am totally blind, and I got blind at age 29, at age 20 rather, 29 years ago. And subsequently, I have gone back to the university and studied extensively at the University of the West Indies and completed a PhD under the supervision of Professor Hopton Dunn. So he has played a seminal role in terms of my professional development, and I want to acknowledge his contribution. And I want to also acknowledge my able assistant, Ms. Chevelle Gerson, who is present here and assisting with my presentation. I want to start my presentation, which is entitled Media, Disability and Development in the Anglophone Caribbean. And I want to start the presentation with a quote from a presentation that I made in the Parliament of Jamaica. I want to remind members of this honorable chamber and the broader public that disability respects no one, as you can be fully able-bodied today and disabled tomorrow. We therefore have to respect these individuals and treat them the way we would want to be treated if we develop a disabling condition. Disability is not restricted to a particular set of individuals. It can happen to any of us at any time. Give them reasonable opportunities to participate in the society. And that is a quote from the presentation that I made in the Parliament recently on the enactment of a disabilities bill. Very limited research has been done on the media and persons with disabilities in the Caribbean and the global South. The CRPD is driving the international agenda for persons with disabilities. In the Caribbean, the Kingston Accord and Declaration of Pétionville were established to drive the disability agenda. These efforts need support. The central argument guiding my presentation is if the varied programs and policies relating to persons with disabilities within the Anglophone Caribbean are to be successfully implemented, the media will have to play a lead role in changing attitudes of non-disabled individuals towards members of this vulnerable group. The fundamental question is how and what is the media doing to aid in the transformation of the lives of persons with disabilities. Media in this context refers to all types of media, including digital media. I anchored my presentation in three theoretical frames: transformation, social cognition, and human agency. For transformation to take place, it requires human action. Human action is to bring about a change in environment. A change in environment should bring about empowerment, and this is what is required from the media for persons with disabilities. The Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities came into effect in 2006. It replaced the standard rules and which had no legal or binding effect. Progressive countries joined together to make the CRPD a reality, and it had as its primary purpose to protect and ensure the full realization of equal opportunities for persons with disabilities. Jamaica was the first country in the world to sign and ratify the CRPD. Similarly, the UN agreed to 17 sustainable goals in 2015. In 6 of the targets of goals, mention is made of persons with disabilities. Goal 1, end poverty in all its form, and I'm just mentioning 2 of them. Goal 4, ensure inclusive and equitable education for and promote lifelong education for all. And this, again, includes persons with disabilities. Regionally, in 2004, the Kingston Accord was formulated. It was developed amongst ministers with responsibility for persons with disabilities across the Caribbean. In 2013, countries from across the Caribbean came again to review the situation of persons with disabilities. The conference was held in Haiti, in Pétionville, Haiti, and among other things, agreed to the digital inclusion of persons with disabilities. Legislation have been formulated throughout the Caribbean subsequently to protect the rights and dignity of persons with disabilities. 6 countries have formulated legislation thus far: Jamaica, Bahamas, Haiti, Guyana, Cayman Islands, Antigua are some of the countries that have formulated legislation to protect the rights of persons with disabilities. There are economic, social, cultural, and environmental rigidities impacting on the progress of persons with disabilities in the Anglophone Caribbean. Negative myths and stigma are pervasive. These myths and stigma can only be changed with strong support from the media. The role of the media, as we traditionally know, is to educate, entertain, and inform. Remember that in the context of this presentation, media covers both traditional and digital media. No transformation can take place in society without the active involvement of the media. There is the absence of training courses on the subject of disability for media practitioners in the region. Training modules are left to the discretion of kind-hearted lecturers. Negative language use is pervasive in the media of persons with disabilities. References such as handicap, wheelchair-bound, cripple are often used to refer to persons with disabilities. Words transmit meaning, and negative words entrench negative attitudes. Stigma towards persons with disabilities. People-first language must be utilized in referencing the members of this community. Persons with disabilities have a right to information. Deaf persons have a right to information, and we heard this morning Professor Dunn make mention of the need for closed caption for persons with who are deaf in the digital era. Very few media entities within the Caribbean offer these services for the deaf or hard of hearing. There is the absence of programs in the media focusing on issues relating to persons with disabilities. Absence of content on persons with disabilities help reinforce negative attitudes and stigma towards this vulnerable population. Very few persons with disabilities are employed in the media in the Caribbean. Absence of employees with disabilities restrict development, experiential knowledge of this population. Employees with disabilities will be able to correct negative languages or references to persons with disabilities. Notwithstanding these challenges of traditional media relating to persons with disabilities, digital media offers hope. Digital media includes all the platforms on the internet: Facebook, Twitter, WhatsApp, Snapchat, etc., are all available to provide opportunities for persons with disabilities. Digital media is by and large unregulated, and it presents opportunities for all participants. Persons with disabilities must exploit all its offerings to bring about the change that they desire. But these can only be done if issues of cost and access are dealt with. And again, from the discussion this morning with the panel with Professor Dunn, we looked at some of the issues relating to cost. And I would like to make some recommendations that could deal with some of these issues that I've mentioned as it relates to media disability and development in the Anglophone Caribbean. One, for tertiary institutions that are involved in training of media practitioners in the Caribbean to design courses that would sensitize these individuals on issues relating to persons with disabilities. Certainly, it will make them more aware of issues such as the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the Sustainable Development Goal, the Kingston Accord, the Declaration of Patientville, and the various legislations that have been formulated. The second recommendation is that for governments within the region to establish special funding mechanisms to assist persons with disabilities to access digital technologies that would allow them to be more effective participants in society. For governments in the region to incentivize private entrepreneurs to develop digital technologies that would be more affordable for persons with disabilities. For television stations to include sign language or closed captioning in the programming so that deaf and hard of hearing individuals can understand what is being communicated. And the final recommendation is for persons with disabilities to exploit the offerings of digital media to advocate for their own programs and policies. In conclusion, global and regional efforts are being made to transform the lives of persons with disabilities. A vacuum exists with the media, consistent driving the disability agenda throughout the Anglophone Caribbean. Persons with disabilities in traditional and digital media must play a lead role in the transformation and empowerment of persons with disabilities. Over 1 billion individuals with disabilities are living across the world, and here lies a great opportunity for research, policy, and programmatic formulation for sustainable development and transformation. And I want to say that there exists a minefield for serious research to take place in the Anglophone Caribbean and by extension the Global South, where persons with disabilities are concerned to bring them into the digital era. May it please you.
Thank you very much, Senator. We're going to do questions at the end if we have time. And I'm up next. I'm Katie Ellis from Curtin University. Do we have the clicker for me to use? This is a lovely picture of my campus at Curtin. You can't see my office in it. But do we? Sorry.
Maybe the previous speaker has it.
No, we're getting it.
Okay.
Okay. I'll be picking up on some of the points that Senator raised in his presentation. So I'm today looking at how digital television can be redesigned to be more inclusive of people with disabilities, focusing especially on captions and audio description. So I think most people are really aware what captions are. They're the words on the bottom of the screen that are there really to provide access to people who are deaf or hard of hearing. Audio description is an access feature for people who are blind or who have a vision impairment to be able to watch television, access television. Audio description is a track of narration which describes the important visual elements of a television show, movie or performance, usually delivered between the lines of dialogue. If we have time at the end of the session today, I can show you an example of it for people who aren't familiar with it. And I've got up here a list of other access features we could use on digital television. My argument is basically that there are 3 things we need to make television more accessible for people with disabilities. The first one being legislation or government support. And secondly, and this is what I've been focusing a lot on in my research recently, is the idea of innovation or interpretive flexibility, and that is how people without disability might benefit from the access features. So, for example, how are people who are not deaf using captions, and how are people who are not blind using audio description? So if we can start thinking about a wider audience for these access features, it could have a really positive effect for the disability community. And finally, we need to look at penalties for broadcasters not making accessible features available to their audiences with disabilities and their audiences without disabilities. So, for example, where I live in Australia, we have some legislation that requires captions to be available on 100% of content screened on free-to-air television between 6 a.m. and midnight every single day. And audio description, we have 0 requirements around audio description in Australia on free-to-air television, so we have 0 hours of free-to-air television. So this is related to some of our legislation in Australia in terms of captions. That's broadly legislated under the Disability Discrimination Act, which says discrimination is unlawful. People with disability should have the same access to the goods and services as everyone else. And it's also legislated under the Broadcasting Services Act, which requires that the commercial broadcasting stations provide that 100% of captioned content. For audio description, which you would think it would be considered under the Disability Discrimination Act in the same way that captions are, but it's because it's not in the Broadcasting Services Act, there's no relationship there. And like I said, so we have no audio description, but there's other legislation in place. I haven't put up on the slide there. Most of the Australian drama content is funded through the screen funding body, Screen Australia. And under Screen Australia regulations, the people who are making dramas for television, they have to create audio description and captions as part of their funding agreement and as part of their marketing agreement. So we actually have a massive library of audio description in Australia that's just not being made available to audiences who might be able to benefit from it because there's no requirement to do it, which is insane. And I've written an article about this in the Cultural Science Journal, which if you wanted to do a search on it, go into more detail there. I had a look at some shows on the Australian public broadcaster, the ABC, and we found that 25% of the shows funded by Screen Australia on the ABC actually had audio description available, but they weren't put on television. So that's the public broadcaster, which again is getting money from the government and has a mandate to be inclusive of all Australians, is not providing that audio description. So to move on to my second point, and I think this is a really illustrative example, is the idea of captions. Just a few years ago, captions were described as visual clutter. You know, really, I've read articles that describe captions as visual clutter, and people who could hear were frustrated when captions were put on the screen and said it affected their viewing. But now we're in a situation where we've got, I've got two articles up here on the slide. First one's from Wired magazine. The title there is "The Real Reason You Use Closed Captions for Everything Now." And in that article, it sort of talks about, binge watching television, how we're all watching so much more TV. And in that article, it suggested that, the more TV you watch, the more TV you miss out on. And closed captions can help you retain more information. So people are turning on the closed captions. And the second article is a blog post, says, "Get over your fear of subtitles, please." And this is written by a woman who says she always has the subtitles or captions on, and her friends and new boyfriends just have to get used to it because this is what she does. And she says, once people start turning the captions on, they again start finding these sorts of uses for captions that they hadn't thought about before. And I'm finding this too with myself. I've got captions on all the time now. And once, I hire a research assistant to do some work for me, turn on the captions and they're watching their TV with all the captions on too. So captions have kind of become mainstream, and this is because of social media. So people are watching, the videos on social media with the captions on so they don't have to turn the sound on, so they can watch videos in situations where they perhaps shouldn't be watching them. So because of the captions on social media, there's more of an expectation that captions should be available everywhere all the time, and they are pretty mainstream now. But despite this, I still see that captions are stigmatised within the Australian broadcasting concept, certainly, as a costly access feature that's only beneficial to a few members of the audience. So in terms of practice under the Broadcasting Services Act, broadcasters can apply for exemptions so they don't have to show captions on TV if it's too difficult. And if there is a situation where broadcasters are caught not showing captions on TV and they have to answer to that, generally what they do is they argue technical difficulty, or sometimes, they blame it on the captioner, who's generally, a woman working in the gig economy in a remote location. So if, there are mistakes and broadcasters don't show captions or they show inaccurate captions, they can get out of being penalised. And so I've put up here perhaps a better practice for Australia to look at are the penalties that Ofcom apply in the UK, where there seem to be much harsher penalties for not having captions when you're supposed to have captions. And I also look at this concept in terms of future-proofing. Now in Australia, even though we have mandated captioning on 6 a.m. till midnight, that's on only the original channels, not the digital multi-channels that got introduced when we got digital TV. So, it could be, our channels are 7, 9 and 10. So 10 might also have channel 11, which is a subsidiary of 10. They don't have to show captions on 11. So what we're finding is, 10 are putting their sport on this channel so they don't have to put the captions on it. And another example I thought of is a better practice perhaps is the 21st Century Communications and Video Accessibility Act from the US here that says that if captions are shown on their first release with captions, if a show is shown with captions on first release, then when it goes to the internet, it has to also be shown with captions then too. So another thing I'm finding with Australian content is they might have a caption show on broadcast, but then when it goes to what we call catch-up television, or you might call it over-the-top television, so their online portals where you go and catch up the shows you missed, they don't put the captions there. So we've got captions on broadcast TV. When it goes online, they just disappear, and I don't see a really good reason for that at all other than stigma. So what can we do about audio description in Australia? It's a big problem. We could legislate. Obviously, I think we need to legislate to get some audio description happening. In 2008, we had a government policy review into audio description, and the outcome of that review was the government suggested that the sector would really resolve this without need for government intervention because business would step in. And I think to a certain extent it has, with Netflix having audio description on original programming, but that's not all programming, and that's a subscription service that some people with disabilities might not be able to afford to access. And that was also 11 years ago, and the sector really still haven't sorted it out. So 2 years ago, in 2017, the government at the time convened, sorry, that's my time, but I'll just quickly wrap this up. They convened an audio description working group, which I was a member of, and part of our terms of reference were we needed to explore non-legislative options. So we weren't really allowed to discuss the need to legislate within that working group. And something I kept bringing up in the group was, why aren't we talking about innovation? How can sighted people benefit from using AD? What are some of the other benefits to the broadcasters? Does it get more people paying attention to a form of television not really many people are tuning into anymore? So, of course, as an academic, I thought this was a wonderful research project. And I ran that project last year where we invited sighted people, different groups of people. So we had people with autism, film students who might be interested in finding out more information about a particular show, television fans, who, if you ever want to do research with lovely people, television fans are your group. Audiobook users and parents of newborns. We said maybe audio description could keep you in touch with your content while you're distracted attending to the demands of having a newborn. And what we found was that people were pretty interested in what are the potential benefits of audio description for sighted people. And the number one thing was multitasking. So people were talking about what they were doing while accessing this audio description. We had people cooking, excuse me, people knitting, people doing craft. We had one person playing the guitar, which he was saying, yeah, I'm a musician, I could have audio description while I play my music. And so the outcome of the project was really an understanding that television is becoming a much more flexible medium of entertainment. And enhancing the understanding, clarifying unclear content. So as I was talking about earlier with the closed captioning, the more we're watching, the more we're missing out on. Audio description was giving people an additional layer of meaning from the text, and was helping people identify culture-specific context and meaning. So people were getting a lot more out of the shows they were watching with audio description. So could it become mainstream? Netflix say that their Sense8 audience viewers are really getting into the audio describer from Sense8 because it is such a complicated show. There's a whole conversation on Twitter about that. And there are other articles online about turning your Netflix shows into an audio book so you can go walk your dog while staying in touch with your favourite television show. Also, you can, watch TV while you're driving the car, which I told the Australian Disability Discrimination Commissioner that particular idea, and he said, no, I think there are some things we shouldn't do. Maybe that's one of them. So just to... my conclusion, again, is back to my 3 points that in order to make television accessible, I don't think the market will just sort it out by itself. We do need the legislation or government support or a champion. We need innovation. How can people without disabilities benefit? What are the potential markets of these features? And we need penalties for people who don't follow the rules. And that is it from me. So, thanks guys. We are going on to Gregg Vanderheiden from the Trade R&D Centre, University of Maryland, College Park. Yep, I'll bring this around.
Yeah, no, it's not mirroring, it's giving the other display. Just hold on.
Just drag it over, isn't that the way it works?
No, I can't, it's up.
Unmaximize it, and then you can just drag it across.
No,
onto that screen.
that's not the problem. The problem is on another screen. It's created a third screen, and it's projecting the third screen instead of my computer screen.
Well, it's still your computer.
Yeah,
Can't you just drag it across? Just drag it.
No, because
sideways,
no,
across from one screen to the other.
No, doesn't work that way. So let's just proceed here. Yes. Yeah. Why don't you go ahead?
Just let her make, and then you sort it out.
Because then I have to release the projector and it'll turn right back around and happen again.
The only thing I can say is if you give your presentation, I can take your slides and drop them in afterwards.
I already did. Why don't you just go with the projector thing I gave you? Okay, so the presentation I'm going to be giving today is in 2 parts. And the first is going to be talking about today and some of the things that we are trying. And then the second one is going to be about tomorrow and the kind of things that are coming. Is it due? Right here. So there's many different kinds of barriers that we're going to be facing in today as people look at this. We think about disabilities, but we also have problems with language. People who are trying to use the computer and the computer is not in their primary language. And this is a major barrier. People who are trying to figure out something complex and to figure it out when it's not even in their language is something that we're finding. So we've been working with community colleges, with job centers, and with libraries, and trying to find out what is it that causes people to have trouble in terms of using the computer. A second one is complexity. The computers are not very simple. many individuals actually come from countries where they've been living in mobile technologies, and suddenly they're seeing something like Windows or the Macintosh. And just think of your experience on a mobile computer, and then think of what it would be if suddenly you looked at Windows. And you've got all these overlapping windows and controls and navigation through the menus. This is a major barrier. We're also finding a problem with what are called digital idioms. There are things that we all take for granted. Digital metaphors, you have windows, you have scroll bars, and these things don't exist in the real world. And for people who are just trying to come onto computers, talking about windows, and they don't see windows, and scroll bars, and what's that? Well, it's a thing on the side that kind of looks like an elevator. Well, how do you use it? Well, you use the mouse, and when you pull the elevator, the scroll bar down, the page goes up, and they're trying to figure out how mice pulling down elevators is actually relevant to trying to use the computer. And we just think of these naturally. It's interesting, we have a save icon, and all of the people who use it today know what it means, but nobody knows why it looks like that, because they have not even seen a floppy disk in their lives, even though we use the floppy disk symbol for our icon. We use a house to stand for the home page, and it's like, what's the logic in this? And then we have sensory and physical demands, so things that we think of as disabilities. People who have low vision, people who can't see the screen very well, and people who are blind, people who have physical disabilities. And all of these things combine together and provide barriers that we find. And these are just some of the barriers. And the problem is that you don't just have one of these. Often people think, oh, if you're blind, that's easy, you can use a screen reader. But you have to remember that people who are blind also may not be familiar with computers and have the trouble with the computer, the idioms and the complexities and the language, and all of this compounds. We get used to some of the colleagues we know who are blind and who are very technical and very bright, and they don't have any trouble. Matter of fact, they may be better on their computers than we are on ours. And then we map that over. But we have to remember that people who have disabilities cover the full spectrum, just like the rest of us of other abilities. We have three problems in trying to provide solutions. One of them is awareness. One of them is existence. One is ease of activating, and one is the ability to even activate them. So if you don't have a solution, that's a real problem. And we don't have good solutions for many disabilities. But even where we have solutions, people are not aware of them. And we also have places where people then are aware of them, but they are not able to use them. And I'll give examples of all of these things, or people who aren't able to activate them. So we're working with individuals, and one of the things we've been looking at is something we call Morphic, which is a little bar that can pop up on the bottom of the screen, and it provides a number of functions. One of them is language. So you can just click on it, it pops up, you change the language, and about 3 seconds later, your computer and all of its menus will be changed into another language, into the language that you used at home to try to overcome the language barrier. The next one over will change the screen resolution. Now, this is different than Zoom, where you have to then pan around the screen to find things. It literally changes the resolution of the screen to make everything larger on the screen. And so we're showing this to people, and they go, oh, this is great. This is the first, now I can see the screen. And you'd say, well, you know this is in Windows. It's always been in Windows. And they go, it is? And nobody knew that you can scale screen. Most of the functions that we exposed from this are all things that are already in the computer. The language change is already in the computer. People don't know that it exists. We also have had people where they know it exists, but it's too hard. So in order to do this, you have to open the control panel, then you have to know where in the control panel to look, then you have to know where to go find it, and then you have to select it, and then you have to reboot the computer, and then when it comes back up, it'll finally be there. And that's just too complicated for somebody who in the first place needed it in their own language because they can't figure out how to navigate the thing in the first place. Screen zoom, we've had it where the difficulty, where somebody will say, you know, you can make the screen larger, and they say yes, but then everybody else complains. We had one situation we were dealing with an elder, and we'd asked, you know, do you use computers? And she said, oh yeah, I used to. And what did you use it for? Well, I use it for mail, and we had this chat with my friends, and we would use it to arrange for getting together. And I said, well, that's really great. Why'd you stop using it? And she said, well, one day I heard the kids in the other room, and they said, the computer's all messed up for Grandma again. And I figured, well, I've had my time. It's their time. So I stopped using the computer because it was too hard to set it up. She couldn't set it up. And when she's done, she couldn't set it back. So one of the things that we're trying here is to have it so you can click, you come in, it automatically sets it up, and when you go, it automatically changes everything back again to make it easier. And we found the same thing with somebody who was in their 40s, and setting up the computer so they were able to use it was too much of a hassle. So we have to figure out how to make it so that it's possible, so that people are aware of it. Then you have to make it that it's easy enough to do. And then some others just said, well, you know, until it's set up for me, I can't use the computer to set it up for me. So having things that will set up for an individual and then change back. So these are just some of the things we're looking at, but we're running into barriers. Somebody said, can you put a button on there for volume? As a matter of fact, while we were sitting here, one of the community colleges wrote and said, when are we going to get the volume button? And I said, you want a volume button on Morphic? And they said, yes. And I said, well, to get Morphic up, you click on the little icon in the taskbar, and up pops Morphic, and then you click on the volume button, and you'd adjust the volume. The taskbar, just 1 inch to the right, is a little speaker icon. You can click on that, and up pops the volume control. And I said, why don't you just use that? And the room was kind of silent, and I sort of said, well, everybody knows you can do that. And it turns out that whenever I give the presentation, a large number of people in the room had no idea that there was a control for controlling the volume right there. So we have this awareness of even things that we think of every day as being very, very plain and simple are not. And so this is a major barrier. The other thing that we need to be looking at as we go forward in tomorrow is that what's coming is going to be even very, very different than what we have today, and we're not ready for it. We're doing a project, and I have some more in a position paper that I've turned in here, so I'll just talk very briefly about this. But we need to start thinking about where we're going to be in 20 years, because in 20 years, the interfaces are going to be very, very different than what we have now, and we're not going to be ready for them. We're not just going to have voice control. We're actually going to have conversations, conversational interfaces. We already have them with Alexa, where you begin talking and you have a conversation to get things. We're going to be using gesture, natural and abstract gestures. And of course, that's great, except many people can't deal with abstract gestures. They don't remember them. Even on their phones, you say, well, just swipe. And they go, I did that. No, 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 don't swipe there. You got to swipe from the middle. If you swipe from the top, it does something different than if you, etc. You're going to be seeing already, beginning to see virtual and augmented reality, where you'll take your phone. They just announced Minecraft, so pretty soon you'll be able to walk around with your phone and look around, and kids will all get together and they'll be building these constructs that you can't see unless you hold your phone up, and then you'll be able to see what they're building. Go look it out. It's called Minecraft World, I think. Minecraft Earth. These things are going to be coming, and that's how they're going to teach programming. And so how do you do that with a physical disability if it's assuming that all the people that are using that are able to use all of these senses at the same time? Probably the furthest in the future is going to be liquid hardware, but we're getting a little bit of sense of that with some of our makerspaces stuff. The ability to have things physically form out of nothing in different forms. And again, this provides some real potential, but it also provides some real barriers. Something that we all think of as being very science fiction is direct brain interfaces, but we are already seeing them. We have cochlear implants, we're having artificial vision, and when all of a sudden your kids come home and you say, oh, I'm never going to put brain implants in my kids to hook them up to their computers, until, remember when they wouldn't give kids calculators in school because, you know, that was a whatever, and then all the other kids had calculators, and what do? We got our kid a calculator. So when the other kids are all going to have their direct brain coupling, when they can visualize things, when they can have their computer impress things without having to have displays, in the beginning these may look like things that will give you artificial vision or hearing, but in the future it could give you the sense of something. You could give impressions without having actually any words associated with them. And this is, we don't even begin to understand or imagine. It's like in the 1960s asking what the internet was going to be using for. Even the brightest minds had no idea. They had some ideas, but they missed entire boats. We'll be able to will things to happen, and we'll be able to merge our technologies with ourselves. And so this is all going to be happening. What does it mean to put alt text on a feeling, okay? The rules that we have today aren't going to apply to these. We need to start figuring it out now because this is going to be on us before we're ready. We will find that our current strategies, our standards, and our policies are not going to work. The only thing we have as an advantage is that we will have new tools. People who cannot process visual information may be able to process virtually visual information that's presented directly to their brain. Or people who have poor physical control, and we're already seeing that, can control things directly from their brain, and we've already have examples of this today. People who have cognitive language and learning disabilities, the way things are standardly presented, there may be entirely different ways to present them. And the ability for AI to process, understand, and then represent information in a form that matches individuals is a whole untapped area. And it may be the first time we have the ability to really start addressing some of the cognitive language and learning disability areas that we've been looking at. Thank you.
Thanks. Great. Okay, am I coming through all right? And indeed, those look like my slides up there on the monitor. So I'm assuming that that's forward, right? No, other way around. Yeah. Okay. So we're a little short on time, and I think you probably need me to do this in about 10 minutes. Does that sound right, Katie?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm not going to set a time.
What I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on, I'm going to be selective in what I'm focusing on for this presentation. And so there's a few things I'll go kind of quickly over, but I'm hoping that I can cover the things that are most relevant for this event. I'll be talking about digital accessibility and the role of standards in the digital divide. And I'm Judy Brewer from the World Wide Web Consortium Web Accessibility Initiative. There's 1 billion people, actually there's now over 1 billion people in the world with disabilities, according to the World Health Organization back in June 2011. And I sometimes like to start there because accessibility gets forgotten so many times in design of everything. And, it's one of the key pieces of the digital divide. It's one of the key pieces of intersectionality. I was enjoying some of Katie's comments and talking about how can you get more people to be taking advantage of the wonderful accommodations that are needed for disabilities. And that may be some of what we need to do, because so many disabilities also are hidden, and there's still so much separation and segregation in society that the needs of people with disabilities often get overlooked. Right now, we're at a time when, and actually this is advancing on my slide, but not, there we go, okay, yeah. There is, there's many devices that, there's a constant increase in the number and types of devices, not only computers and tablets and mobile phones, but game consoles, TV, we have to think about how accessibility works on all these different devices, and then we have to think about how it works for everything we do in society that has any digital element to it. So it may be the libraries, it may be how you handle data, it may be how you handle publishing, or connections between different sensors in the home and so forth. And we can do that partly with the Open Web Platform, which is based on HTML5 with a lot of other connected technologies. When we're trying to make things accessible, we have to make that accessible across a very broad range of functional needs. So that includes vision, hearing, motor disabilities, speech, cognitive disabilities, neurological, multiple disabilities, and aging-related conditions, which are often combinations, sometimes of minor changes in different things, and people may never think of the term disability, and they may not look for solutions that are packaged that way in the devices and the software they're using, but that's indeed very similar from a functional standpoint. So the space that I work in, we're working across these different devices. We're working to try to serve these different communities. We're working across these different kinds of functional issues. And we're also looking at different architectural issues on the web, and then focusing on certain areas. And again, this is one place where I'm going to be selective because of time. So for instance, if you, pardon? Okay, so with regard to live video chat, you can use web real-time communication, WebRTC, that's native to the web. We need to make sure that real-time text that the deaf community relies on is well integrated into RTC. With regard to the immersive realities that people are using in different areas, one of the areas we're looking at is virtual reality, where you you immerse yourself in an environment, and augmentative reality, where you're potentially showing objects in an environment. And let's see. Just to dive into one of those for a moment, in terms of challenges of making virtual reality accessible, without talking about the how yet, the kinds of things that we need to think about how to accomplish are moving around in virtual reality space. It's highly interactive, it's active, it's dynamic, you're moving through space, and so things are, the visual view of things is changing as you move through them. How do you see these? How do you hear them? How do you know that there's a relevant object you're coming into proximity with? And how do you interact with that in the context of the surrounding environment? So drawing from what we've been working on with regard to web accessibility, the accessibility principles we've been working with are still relevant. Is the environment perceivable? Is it operable? Is it understandable? Does it work, going forward, going back, and so forth? And so what is the alternative access one needs to visual, audio, navigation modes? So the work that I do is based at the World Wide Web Consortium, or W3C for short. And we develop standards for the web, but we think of the web very broadly across many, many technologies that are converging onto the web. The work that we do is international in terms of the membership of W3C and who participates in the work as well. It's vendor neutral, so different kinds of organizations come in and they're saying we want to build something by consensus in a collaborative way so that that work can be used freely by anyone. One of the many things that W3C does is the work of the Web Accessibility Initiative. So that means taking any of the standards that W3C develops and trying to make sure that those will support and help advance accessibility, and also that we will not inadvertently create barriers with some of the new standards that we do. And so there's a constant effort at vigilance for that, to look at every new technology that's coming along, the latest media standards, so forth, to make sure, are we going further in support for audio description on the web and so forth. So this is a coordinated program of accessibility work that crosses all of W3C's typically 40 or 50 different working groups working on different standards at a given time. And we develop specific accessibility standards where needed, guidelines, technical implementation resources, training materials, things to improve testing of accessibility. We track certain research questions, and we focus some on standards harmonization as well, which I'll speak to in a moment. But in particular, we're bringing the different stakeholders to the table: industry, disability, government, and research. So the work that we do in the Web Accessibility Initiative, consensus-based, community responsive, we might, for a given set of guidelines, actually respond to thousands of public comments on the web that we get in from different communities. And it's multi-stakeholder, using an open process so people can see what happens with their comments. So I mentioned standards harmonization, and to me, this is one of the things that's particularly important when we're trying to build a scalable worldwide effort to make digital technologies accessible. And that's coming up with a common set of guidelines and standards for accessibility. If you harmonize what those standards are that are being taken up around the world, you can reuse training materials, you can get better support from testing materials, the certification approaches that arise in the field are more broadly relevant. You can come up with better ways to support production of that content as well. So there's one standard, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which has been most broadly adopted around the world. I'm seeing a few people nod. WCAG for short. This is one thing that Gregg Vanderheiden, who just spoke, was the co-chair of that group for years to create a vision for how you could describe accessibility on the web. The Web Content Accessibility Guidelines version that's been most broadly adopted, WCAG 2.0, addresses accessibility of web content and applications. It also applies to mobile. It's an international standard that is also endorsed by the International Standards Organization. And it's been adopted and referenced by many national governments, many businesses, many parts of the community. We did an update to this in June 2018, WCAG 2.1, that expands provisions across 3 areas: mobile, low vision, and cognitive. And in each case, we have more to do, but we wanted to be adding some provisions there. We also wanted to ensure that this was backwards compatible, but allowing for evolution going forward. And we're planning now on what happens next. But basically what we did there was we kept the principles the same, the guidelines the same, but we expanded the normative layer, the success criteria, and now we're filling in additional techniques, examples, benefits, freely available on the web. Dive in and use it if you haven't already. What kinds of things were we trying to address in 2.1? For instance, in mobile, we wanted to improve support for touch interactions, and that's not just on a mobile phone, but on many devices now. we wanted to avoid unintended activation of device sensors. So for instance, if you have difficulty controlling your hand movement, you can reduce the sensitivity, or you can turn off certain things for that. It expands provision for low vision so that there's better contrast requirements on graphics, and it improves the text and layout adaptability. When you increase the size of text, there's reflow issues that need to be addressed. And then you need to expand provisions for cognitive and learning disabilities. And there's a great deal more to do in that area. And let's see. So I'm going to go past right now that we have guidelines also on authoring tool accessibility guidelines that help support more efficient production of accessible content. And we have guidelines on browsers and media players and mobile devices that address what, for instance, a browser will render for somebody. Once you have the accessibility built into a website, how do you make that visible? I do want to mention ARIA, the Accessible Rich Internet Applications, which provides expanded capabilities for accessibility of dynamic, interactive web content and applications. And ARIA 1.1, not 1.2, which my slide says, was also completed in 2017. There's many accessible API mappings that allow ARIA to be used with different assistive technologies. Right now, we're working on expanding ARIA to enable more portability across different markup languages so that those accessibility areas are well covered regardless of which technology you're in. Testing of accessibility is still a challenge, and one of the things we're working on there is to advance the efficiency and the reliability of testing. Website developers, designers, and managers, if they're making a site accessible, they want to know very practically, are we accessible yet? Did we do the right work? And this is an area that I think there's more research needed in. The approach we're taking is to develop more standard rules for testing, with the hope that eventually this will be more automatable, particularly through the inclusion of machine learning. So we're looking at a very standard syntax for the test rules, and we're looking at tapping into the databases, which sometimes are like 500,000 data samples from different companies, from different organizations, that we can then draw on and make this more automatically testable. I'll mention briefly some of the resources we have for learning about web content accessibility guidelines, as well as everything else that we're doing with regard to digital accessibility. We updated our website for WAI, for Web Accessibility Initiative, about a year ago, and so it's a learning resource area now where you can go and look at accessibility fundamentals, planning and policies, design and development, testing and evaluating, teaching and advocating, standards and guidelines. There's more than 70 different resources we have in that area that are now far more discoverable than they were before. And we're starting to move more and more of our resources to a video format. And so right now I'm just showing the lead page for about 10 different videos. These are each 1 minute. And they introduce different concepts for accessibility, primarily with regard to web and mobile, but the principles also carry over to other technologies as well. We're trying to increase understanding of digital accessibility around the world. So another thing we're working on currently is a curriculum effort that will be an essentially an open source curriculum, starting with web and mobile accessibility, that will be a core, like an authoritative reference curriculum. We'll build one course on that, or a series of a few courses showcasing different trainers, but this curriculum would be something that anyone can build any kind of course on. We're also looking at partners to be translating that so that we can get that out into more countries. So I want to mention a few things in closing in terms of research and standardization needs and with regard to digital accessibility. And I'll add a few more comments that are then the ones that are showing on the slide right now. And then I'll be wrapping up. So in terms of themes that I'm concerned about with regard to research of digital accessibility as part of the overall digital divide, there's an amazing variety of technologies that are coming into play right now, and we need to be thinking about accessibility of all of them. And unless there's an established accessibility community in any one area, then the tendency is for people not to think of that, for some reason to think it's not relevant, or there's not people who need that space to be accessible. There's the breadth of functional needs that I talked about before, and sometimes when you get into a new area, such as virtual reality or other types of partially immersive environments, such as augmented reality, you have to rethink, the principles are the same, but you have to rethink the details for each different functional need. And then additionally, in terms of leveraging some of the technologies themselves, some of these technologies will help us be able to build more accessible environments if we leverage them proactively. And so one of the things we'd like to be doing is to be road mapping how different types of artificial intelligence can support creating digital environments in different ways. I mentioned the testing. I could go on for a few hours about other possibilities, but I won't do that right now. Another theme to think of is increasing understanding of why accessibility often fails in implementation despite standards and regulations. So I still am surprised at the number of times accessibility is overlooked when one looks at digital divide issues, when one looks at other divide issues. And I think we need to better understand why this is so easily forgotten and how we can, in other words, we need to research the social science if we want the harder science to actually go anywhere. One of my personal hopes is that we need to increase the accessibility of science and technology curriculum so that people with disabilities can be learning and creatively applying our own user experiences. And this applies more, above all else, to younger people with disabilities who are coming along. I think we need to pull people into the field. And I look so often at the science and technology curricula out there, and it's not accessible. So there's a barrier to bringing in the creative and the passionate energy that could be helping drive this field forward. We're missing opportunities to capture the innovative insights of a lot of people with disabilities, I think. One of the other issues that we've been looking at some recently in the Web Accessibility Initiative at W3C is how can we increase uptake in underserved communities, including in low and middle income countries, in indigenous communities that are often underserved in multiple ways at once, and yet all of these areas have people with disabilities who are often very, very interested in leveraging the benefits of digital technologies, but may have trouble even getting connected to the internet. So we're starting to change the way we're developing resources so they'll be more translatable, trying to pull together translation teams, and also to get more input from low and middle income countries and indigenous communities into how we're proceeding with our work at W3C. So if you're interested in learning more about any of the work we're doing or talking about further research agendas, our website is w3.org/WAI, Web Accessibility Initiative. Again, w3.org/WAI for Web Accessibility Initiative. And thank you very much. And I'm going to give this microphone back to Katie. Oh, you've got your own. Okay.
Wonderful. Thanks, Katie. Okay, so we've gone very over time today, but if we have one or two questions, I think that can be accommodated. If everyone wants to rush off and get a drink, we'll understand though. I think they want the drink. You got a question? I have one. Yep.
Just very quickly, in the UK, we've put the legislation into place for public sector websites, and again, like that's we feel like there's more we can do. There's always more we can do, but again, we feel like we're kind of a bit ahead of the game in some ways. A lot of the chat now is around. Now that we've legislated that public sector websites need to be accessible, what about private sector, and how do we approach that? And that's kind of a lot of the questions that my minister gets and others get. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are for kind of how we should approach that kind of next horizon.
Katie might want to comment on that as well, because I think Australia has done that. And so every country has a different type of approach for legislating, and I'm based in the US, so I'm more familiar with that. And in the United States, we have a patchwork of different laws and regulations. Some of them take a civil rights approach, such as the Americans with Disabilities Act. Some of them take a procurement approach, so it's looking at what's purchased. And for now, under the EU, you've got 301-549, European Norm 301-549, which is procurement legislation that actually somewhat followed the approach of U.S. Section 508 procurement legislation, and that's interesting because it's for technology in government for the most part in the U.S. In Europe, it applies, I think, a little bit more broadly, but it's an incentive legislation that then can affect what happens in the private sector. In the U.S., the Americans with Disabilities Act, part of that applies to what's called places of public accommodations. So a private sector business that is used by the public in certain ways will be required there. But I've seen in the past a few years, I think several more countries coming online with requirements for the private sector. I think we actually have a page on our website that has a reference for laws and policies in different countries. You can look around there, you can talk with people. I think I saw Gregg wanting to grab for the microphone, so. Okay.
Yeah, well, we should. Yeah, when you talk about private, I think we could talk about government and then public and then private. If you take and you start talking about, well, the government is public and all of the companies and stores and storefronts, that's all private. That's not private, that's public. Those are public places of accommodation. So I think we should talk about government, and then we should talk about public, and then we have private. And the private is sort of off in a separate place. Your houses don't have to be accessible, although in the UK they have visitability laws and stuff like this, which is progressive. So the EN 301 also, by the way, is started off procurement, but now with the new web guidelines, it's now gone broader than that. And even in the United States, 508 is a procurement, but it's also a procurement and build, but it's being used in the private sector also for when someone says it needs to be accessible and they say, well, what's the measuring stick? It's a measuring stick. So the WCAG isn't a regulation, it's a standard, it's a measuring stick. That's where standards came from, ways of measuring. And so it can be used in a lot of different ways. You can do it with civil rights, as we said with the ADA. Do people who have disabilities have a right to go shopping? Do they have a right to get information from a company? You can do it with EEOC, equal opportunity in terms of employment. If I'm going to hire somebody into my company, but they can't access any of the manuals, the guidelines, the meeting schedule, they don't even know when they're supposed to show up. They can't turn their work in because their work in, they can't be a part of the communication. So just by equal opportunity is a huge driver for making sure that everything on the website. So these are kind of ways to look at it, but I wouldn't call it private. I would call it, public accommodation or employment, kinds of accommodations in those ways. Yes.
I just want to indicate that, most of the progressive changes that we have seen over the years with regards to persons with disabilities have come about when we put legislation in place to protect the rights of these individuals. And access to information is really a fundamental right now. As a matter of fact, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities have it down as one of the fundamental rights. And I believe that if this is the case, then all groups within the society, whether it be in public or private sphere, have to respect these rights. And, I think we have to make sure that the necessary legislative regimes are put in place to protect these rights. Because if you just leave it up to sheer goodwill and policy, I don't think you're going to see it happening. I mean, I laud what I see happening in Britain and, the United States and Australia and New Zealand in terms of progressive initiative and how persons with disabilities have been integrated in their society. But that integration has come about because of legislative action. And I think that, you have to just continue putting in place these measures, because the work is never done as it relates to persons with disabilities. You might think that you're doing well, but there's a whole lot of work that needs to be done in order to make sure that persons with disabilities are fully integrated in society.
I also wanted to point out the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. It says, this is something governments sign up to and therefore make a commitment to, but it also says within the convention that they're not going to be able to do this unless they can find a way to get businesses on board as well. And that's something I look at in the broadcasting work that I do. So, the government says, yes, we will commit to captions and audio description, actually, they've said. But, that's not going to happen unless they can convince channels 7, 9 and 10 to do it too. You know what I mean? So their commitment to the UNCRPD has been that working group that I mentioned. We all got together and talked about it, couldn't agree about what to do, but we came up with 3 options. So that's, and I think we need to go further than that, and I agree that legislation is something that we really need to look at.
I might have a brief, thing which probably there isn't time to talk about, but I was streaming the Caribbean IGF, a week or 2 ago, and Deirdre Williams, I think she's from St. Kitts, and they were doing their new restating their mission, and she raised the fact that inclusion, the word inclusion, suggests that there is the other and thus is exclusionary, and they struggled for over an hour or just to try and find an expression that didn't do this, and they had universal things as well. They had used universal somewhere else, and that wasn't going to do it. And I don't know that they ever actually came up with anything. Do you have any thoughts about language?
I'll just say something very quickly and then I'll pass to you. I attended an expert meeting at the UN last year and this came up, and the suggestion there was, what about dignity? Instead of talking about access or inclusion, talk about dignity. So that's, you know, a way of including everyone. You know, we need access to the internet for dignity, basically. It's for our humanity.
I'm actually not clear on the question, like what's the problem you're trying to address?
I will forward you a link to the discussion so you can see it. But basically, they were saying that by the, you know, that the idea that it's this, I think it's a follow-up from this idea that people aren't special needs, they're specific needs. It's that same kind of argument that by talking about being inclusionary, you're suggesting that these people are not within the mainstream, and there should be language which is to get into what Floyd was saying, that it's basically, it's universal, it's about everyone.
Yeah, I think, you know, just speaking as somebody with a disability, I think that most people I know with disabilities are comfortable saying the word disability and talking about accessibility, and then when that's part of a broader discussion, to me, the word inclusion can be very useful, but I feel like I'm going to look at the context you're talking about, because it sounds like there's more of a. I don't hear many people speaking in favor of exclusion, but I do see it happening a lot, and so I think there's advantages to emphasizing inclusion. I'm going to pass the mic in case someone else has something to say on this.
Sometimes it's a problem with language in that it's a problem with translation, in that you'd say, well, you have a nice word, inclusion, but in our language there isn't an equivalent word. Is that the kind of thing you're looking at? Or are you saying that if you talk about inclusion...
By saying inclusion, you imply that these people are not included and are therefore somehow different.
Oh, no, that's the flip of that. What you're saying by inclusion is that there is no other group. That right now people will talk about people with disabilities as if that's a group over there.
At this meeting.
Oh, yes, okay, yeah, no. Some people think of inclusive design means designing for people with disabilities, and it doesn't. It means designing for everybody, for people, period, whether they have disabilities, or they're tall, or they're short, or they're male, or they're female, or they're Australian, or English, or German, whether they're, you know, any kind of a characteristic people vary on. When you design, think about all of the variety of people and make your design to include all of them. So it sounded like the trick was that people were thinking of inclusive design as being disability design, and that means that everybody else must be someplace else, and that's not what it means. The meaning of inclusive design and inclusion is that there is no boundary between any people of one type and of another type.
Context is important, and one of the things I know that originally persons with disabilities were at the forefront of, in terms of its advocacy, the use of the term inclusion, because we say nothing about us without us, because we want to be included in everything that relates to us. And now you find all different types of groups come and they are advocating for inclusion, because senior citizens are advocating for inclusion. Children's rights groups are advocating for inclusion, etc. So, you know, I mean, context is extremely important where the language is concerned. My understanding of the concept is that persons with disabilities want to be brought to the table to participate in whatsoever discussion or actions taking place with them. They don't want non-disabled persons to be making decisions on their behalf without their input.
I think that might be a good place to end it, maybe. Okay, thank you all for attending the session this afternoon, and I believe we're back in the same place where we had lunch earlier today, but in the cocktail lounge of that building. So. Okay, thank you. Thank you.